Hello, how are you? Here I will help you sleep with a crime story that has happened with the sound of comfortable rain. Of course, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel for the good of all of us. Let's get started. Story 1. A very special athlete, a hellacious competitor, is Chris Benoit. Chris Benoit found dead in his Atlanta home along with his wife and young son. They say they cannot believe this has happened. What role steroids played in the Benoit murder-suicide, the tragedy has made clear. I have battled and lost. On June 25, 2009, the wrestling world woke up to a tragedy that would forever change its history. Chris Benoit, the former WWE World Heavyweight Champion, was now a part of one of the most horrifying events in wrestling history. In a shocking turn of events, Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their son Daniel were found dead in their Fayetteville, Georgia home. What seemed like an ordinary tragedy quickly turned into something much darker. A triple homicide followed by Benoit's own suicide. This wasn't the man fans knew and loved. This was something else. But why? What would drive a hero to commit such a horrific act? Today we're taking a look into the details of that weekend, and what caused the WWE hero to commit a murder-suicide. Benoit was known as a devoted family man, especially by those closest to him. To the wrestling world, though he was a powerhouse, one of the biggest names in the sport. At 40 years old, he was on the rise, taking on fight after fight. The rabid Wolverine was especially beloved in his home country of Canada, where it seemed he could balance his brutal in-ring persona with being the perfect father at home. Wrestling icon Chris Jericho once said, "But Benoit had a demanding life." In wrestling, careers are often shorter than in other fields, a reality driven by the dangerous nature of the sport. Even though the matches are scripted, the physical toll is real. Wrestlers get banged up, often enduring injuries that would sideline anyone else. Still, they push themselves to perform as many matches as possible during their limited window of opportunity. Benoit was no exception. He was always on the road jumping from one ring to the next, no matter how far he traveled. If there was a show, he was there. That's what made what happened on June 23, 2007, all the more shocking. Leading up to the tragedy, Chris Benoit's behavior began to raise serious concerns among those closest to him. As a seasoned wrestler, Benoit was no stranger to the demands of the WWE schedule, but in the days before his family's death, something changed. On June 25, 2009, Benoit was scheduled to travel to a WWE event in Houston, Texas. But he missed his flight, which was highly unusual for him. Chavo Guerrero, a close friend and fellow wrestler, was the first to notice that something was off. When Benoit finally reached out to him, his voice sounded strange, almost disconnected. During the phone call, Benoit showed his love for Chavo in a way that wasn't normal, and that got him really concerned. Benoit then explained that his wife, Nancy, had been vomiting blood, and that their son Daniel was also seriously ill. This was more than enough to worry anyone, and it seemed like a reasonable explanation for his absence. Chavo thought that it was likely a temporary situation, and hoped to catch up with Benoit when they eventually met in Houston. But the next day, Benoit's behavior became even more bizarre. He left a series of odd voicemails for Chavo, apologizing for missing the show, but assuring him that he would catch the next flight to Houston. The voicemail didn't sound like Benoit, though. His tone was off, and his words seemed somewhat erratic. He also mentioned that he would be in Houston by 8 a.m., which was inconsistent with the time he would have needed to make the flight. What seemed like a simple family emergency had quickly turned into something alarming, and Chavo wasn't the only one who noticed. Others in the WWE community were beginning to worry that something bad was about to happen. Benoit mentioned that he had missed his flight and would be late to the WWE event in Beaumont, Texas, which was unusual since he was a professional who was always on time. He sounded groggy and exhausted and ended the message with him. It wasn't something Benoit typically said to a colleague, and it raised red flags. At first, Chavo tried to brush it off, thinking, maybe Benoit is just overwhelmed with his sick family and all the care he's been providing. But something still fell off. So just 12 minutes after receiving the voicemail, Chavo called him back, only to get no answer. He left a message, asking Benoit to call him back ASAP. At 3:44 p.m., Benoit returned the call, and explained he missed the first call because he was changing his flight to a later time. Chavo was still uneasy, and asked if something else was going on. Benoit brushed it off, claiming it had been an extremely stressful day, and that his family suddenly falling ill had worn him out. But Chavo didn't buy it because he had known Benoit long enough to know there was more to the story, but he decided not to push. They'd talk later, after the fight. Chavo ended the call with, at 3:51 a.m. on Sunday, June 24th. Chavo and Scott Armstrong, both close friends of Benoit, received more odd texts from him. One of the messages contained the address of Benoit's family home, while the other mentioned that his dogs were safely locked in their enclosure near the pool and that the garage door was still open. The texts were strange, but it was 3:51 a.m., so no one thought much of it. They figured it was just an accident and went back to sleep. Chavo assumed Benoit had just made a mistake. A few hours later, Chavo was standing outside Houston Airport, waiting for Benoit to arrive. But hours passed, and he never showed. WWE officials took the next step and called the Fayetteville police to perform a welfare check on Benoit and his family. On Monday, June 29, 2009, the WWE was getting ready for Raw and Corpus Christi. Johnny Ace was shown texts sent from Benoit and Nancy's phones early Sunday morning. These were texts that didn't exactly sound like they were coming from someone in the right frame of mind. With no word from Benoit, WWE called in the Fayetteville police for a welfare check. By 4:15 p.m., they got the call. 3 bodies were found in the Benoit house, and the scene was officially labeled a major crime scene. The bodies of Chris, his wife Nancy, and their son Daniel were found in different parts of the house. The murders of Nancy and Daniel were a nightmare. On Friday, June 22, 2007, Benoit murdered his wife in the bonus room of their Fayetteville home. Police later revealed that Nancy's limbs were bound before her death, with her arms tied with coaxial cables and her feet duct taped together. In the kitchen trash, they found a balled-up tube sock and tape, soaked in dried blood. Authorities believed it was used as a makeshift gag before Nancy was killed. Her body was discovered wrapped in a blanket, next to a Bible. The injuries showed that Benoit had pressed his knee into her back while pulling a cord around her neck, strangling her. But there were no signs of a struggle leading up to her death, and toxicology reports found alcohol in Nancy's system, but it was unclear whether it was consumed before her death or because of decomposition. The decomposition also made it hard to determine the levels of hydrocodone and alprazolam that were present in her body. But the medical examiner found no evidence that Nancy was as sedated as their son had been before he was killed. Daniel was Benoit's 3rd child and 2nd son, who was found dead in his bedroom the following day, June 30th, 2009. Daniel had 2 older siblings from Benoit's first marriage and was Nancy's only child. He was suffocated, and another Bible was found next to his body. But there were no bruises. The internal injuries to his throat confirmed the cause of death. Reports concluded that Daniel had been sedated with Xanax and was unconscious at the time of his death. His body had started decomposing, but it wasn't nearly as bad as his mother. Just hours before taking his own life on June 31st, 2009, Benoit's internet searches raised serious questions about what he was planning. Among the final searches were how to tie a knot for hanging and how long it would take for a body to decompose. These types of searches are proof of a man who wasn't spiraling in confusion, but preparing for something diabolical. The last known photograph of Benoit, taken on June 22, 2000, captured him at Dr. Phil Aston's office, which would precede the nightmare about to unfold. Investigations later revealed Benoit had searched for ways to break a neck, a disturbing detail disclosed by his former fiancée, Nancy Toffelon, during a 2016 podcast. However, the Fayette County Sheriff's Office report didn't confirm these searches, and Benoit's autopsy didn't show neck injuries. Then there was the note, a final message found in a Bible next to the bodies of his wife and son. It simply read, "I'm preparing to leave this earth." No one knew exactly what it meant, but it felt like a final goodbye, maybe even a confession, as if Benoit was trying to make sense of what he had just done. The note was later sent to his first wife, Martina, and their 2 children in Canada. Benoit's father, Michael, confirmed it existed, suggesting the tragedy was planned rather than impulsive. The Bible, found beside Nancy and Daniel as well, only added to the dark nature of the scene. The note reflected guilt, while others saw it as Benoit finally coming to terms with his actions. In his final days, Benoit's life was overshadowed by darkness. Years of head injuries from wrestling had taken a severe toll on his brain, and the emotional weight of losing his close friend Eddie Guerrero seemed to push him further into despair. His mental state had gotten worse, and this combination of physical and emotional struggles ultimately led to one of the most tragic and disturbing events in wrestling history. He was found in his home gym, hanging from a pulley system with a towel around his neck. The weight of the gym equipment caused his neck to snap instantly. He removed the bar from a lat pull-down machine in his gym and fashioned a noose from the machine's cable. After releasing the weights, he strangled himself to death. It was a brutal, shocking way to end his life. No one could have expected it, especially after what he'd done to his own family. Toxicology reports on Benoit showed elevated testosterone levels, consistent with steroid use. They also found traces of Xanax and hydrocodone, which led to more questions. Was he under the influence when he murdered Nancy and Daniel? It's impossible to know for sure, but his mental state in those final days clearly wasn't stable. Looking at the crime scene, the autopsies and the toxicology reports proved this was a methodical crime. Benoit took days to kill his wife, his son, and finally himself. Steroids were found in the Benoit house, which means roid rage might have been behind his actions. Some doctors have connected steroid use to uncontrollable anger and other psychological issues, including paranoia. Authorities also noticed a big gap between the deaths of Nancy and their son Daniel, which suggests that the murders were deliberate rather than out of control anger, and placing a Bible next to each body isn't consistent with a violent outburst. Prosecutors in New York began looking into Benoit's deliveries from Signature Pharmacy and MedicsLife.com, companies that sold steroids and HGH online. Terrence Kindlon, the lawyer for MedXLife co-owner Gary Brandwine, denied the accusations that his client had sold steroids to Benoit. Sports Illustrated later reported that 3 packages from Signature Pharmacy were sent to Benoit, with the first arriving in December 2005 at a Texas address. A second was sent in February 2006 to Peachtree City, Georgia, and the third in July 2006 to Fort Walton Beach, Florida. This was part of a broader investigation into steroid use among wrestlers that named several other wrestlers, including Kurt Angle, Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio, Edge, and Gregory Helms. After the Benoit family tragedy, everyone wanted answers, but the more authorities looked into it, the more questions they found. By the time they discovered the bodies of Nancy and Daniel Benoit on June 25, 2007, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, but the picture never really came together. The investigation was straightforward enough. Benoit murdered his wife and son before ending his own life. But something fell off. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. The scene was unsettlingly calm. Nancy's hands and feet were bound, and a Bible was found next to her and Daniel. Was this a sign of Benoit's breakdown? Or was he trying to make some twisted sense of what he'd done? Then there were the searches. Benoit's internet history was, well, disturbing. He'd Googled how to break a neck, and how long it takes for a body to decompose. And the final search was on how to tie a knot for hanging. Benoit spent his last hours meticulously planning everything. Forensics didn't exactly clear things up. Benoit died from hanging with no broken neck, like some had speculated. Instead, he used a towel and pulley system in his home gym. Was this an attempt to control his death, or just a sign of impaired judgment? We'll never know for sure. The toxicology report showed elevated testosterone levels that proved long-term steroid use. But it wasn't just the drugs. Benoit's autopsy revealed early signs of dementia and CTE. This was brain damage from years of hits to the head. CTE messes with your behavior, causes mood swings, and can lead to violence. Could that have been the tipping point? To top it all off, Eddie Guerrero, Benoit's best friend, died 2 years earlier, and many believe that loss pushed him over the edge. Eddie's passing hit him hard, and people close to Benoit have said it sent him into a downward spiral. He became more withdrawn, distant, and seemed to be struggling mentally. The combination of losing someone so close, along with the physical wear and tear from years of wrestling, put a lot of pressure on him. That pressure, along with everything else he was dealing with, probably started breaking him down mentally and emotionally. Neuroscientist and former wrestler Christopher Nowinski believes Benoit had too many untreated concussions, which might have slowly eaten away at his mental health. Nowinski pointed out that Benoit was one of the few wrestlers who willingly took chair shots to the back of his head, which was downright reckless. After testing Benoit's brain, Dr. Julian Bales, head of neurosurgery at West Virginia University, found that Benoit's brain was in such bad shape that it looked like it belonged to an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. Other tests revealed Benoit had severe chronic traumatic encephalopathy, with damage spreading across all 4 lobes of his brain and brainstem. Bales and his team concluded that this kind of brain trauma could lead to dementia, which might trigger extreme behavioral issues. Benoit's father later suggested that this brain damage was likely the root cause of the tragic murder-suicide, but the WWE dismissed this as speculative. Nancy had also filed for divorce in May 2003, claiming abuse from Benoit, but withdrew the filing 3 months later. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution reported that Nancy may have suspected Benoit of having an affair with a female WWE wrestler, and the couple might have also fought over a life insurance policy. This information came from a report released by the Fayette County Sheriff's Office. There's no simple answer to what caused the Benoit family tragedy, but several theories have tried to make sense of how everything went so horribly wrong. WWE Chairman Vince McMahon weighed in on the tragedy, saying that it was a result of mental health issues combined with the brutal physical toll of Benoit's wrestling career. McMahon believes that Benoit's actions weren't just about steroids, but rather the damage done to his body and the emotional strain he was under. While McMahon's comments were controversial, it makes sense when you consider how wrestling affects people physically and mentally. Benoit was clearly struggling, and this was a tragic result of the years of stress, both physical and emotional, that he'd been under. A strange detail also surfaced when a statement about Nancy's death was added to the Chris Benoit Wikipedia page just 14 hours before police discovered the bodies of Benoit and his family. The update read, Chris Benoit was replaced by Johnny Nitro for the ECW World Championship match at Vengeance, as Benoit was not there due to personal issues stemming from the death of his wife Nancy. It was spotted by Wyconas and later picked up by Fox News. The addition was made at 4 a.m. on June 25th. Nearly 10.5 hours before the bodies were discovered at 2:30 p.m. the same day. What's more bizarre is that the IP address of the editor traced back to Stamford, Connecticut, the WWE headquarters at the time. When this early report made its way into the media, the anonymous editor claimed it was just a huge coincidence and nothing more. Story 2. I just want to say I'm very happy that it's all over. It's been a long time waiting for this. It really happened with the prosecution team. They've really done a great job. They say justice doesn't bring back the dead, but it can bring a sliver of peace to the living. For Connie Bennett, the woman whose haunted face you see in that video, peace is a long time coming. 41 years ago, her world shattered when she discovered her son and his family brutally murdered in their Colorado home. And trust me when I say it wasn't just horrifying, it was the kind of nightmare that keeps you awake at night. The killer didn't just stop at using a hammer to end his victims' lives. He went even further, committing unspeakable acts that shocked everyone who heard the details. At that time, forensic science wasn't what it is today, and for years, his connection to the Bennett family murders and several other killings remained hidden. The truth only came to light when advances in technology finally exposed the full scope of his horrifying spree. So who was this twisted murderer, and how did he go unnoticed for so long? Well, before we dive into his dark history, let's start by getting to know the victims first. Like any other family, the Bennett family was full of love, laughter, and big dreams. Bruce and Deborah Bennett, a young couple who got married in the 1970s, couldn't wait to start their life together. Bruce, born on April 22nd in Denver, Colorado, had what you might call a normal childhood. Nothing too extraordinary, just a regular guy growing up with his two brothers, Richard and Daniel. But Deborah's story was a bit more complicated. As the oldest of 4 kids, she had to grow up fast after losing her mother at a young age. With her dad, Ernest, a war veteran, she became the caretaker for her younger siblings. Life was tough, but she kept her family together. Eventually, they moved to Colorado, and it was there that Deborah's brother Larry introduced her to Bruce. The two hit it off instantly, and before long Bruce and Deborah were inseparable. They fell in love quickly, and decided to start a family of their own. Later on, Bruce enlisted in the Navy, serving as a sonar analyst at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It was a job that gave him the chance to work with some pretty high-tech equipment, and more importantly, provided the steady income he needed to support his growing family. So in January of 1976, their first daughter Melissa was born, and they couldn't have been more thrilled. Then, 5 years later, in 1981, their second daughter, Vanessa, arrived. Their little family of 4 was complete. When Bruce wrapped up his service in the Navy, he had worked hard to create a more comfortable life for them. In 1983, with some help from their savings and a loan, they bought their first home in Aurora, Colorado. Life seemed perfect. The Bennetts worked together in the family's furniture distribution business, and Bruce was also studying to become an air traffic controller. They were making it work. Every day was filled with moments of joy, family dinners, and the excitement of their daughters growing up in a happy, safe home. Melissa and Vanessa were thriving in this warm, loving environment, and Bruce and Deborah felt like they had everything they ever wanted. But just when everything seemed perfect, in early 1984, their world was shattered. It was Sunday, January 15th that year, when the Bennett family was in full celebration mode. They were hosting a pre-birthday gathering for Melissa, who was about to turn 8. Deborah had already planned a party at school for their daughter, but they decided to have an additional family celebration at home. The house was filled with laughter, chatter, and the sweet aroma of a delicious cake as everyone gathered to celebrate the little girl's upcoming special day. As the evening wore on, Melissa's grandparents and uncles started to head home. One of her uncles noticed the garage door was still open and reminded Bruce to close it before he left. Little did he know that simple gesture would be the turning point for the Bennett family. Then, the next morning, on January 16, 1984, Bruce's mother, Constance Connie Bennett, got an unsettling call. The family's furniture store had called, stating that Bruce and Deborah hadn't shown up for work, and no one was answering their phones at the house. Concerned, Connie decided to head over to the Bennett home to check on them. When she arrived, she immediately noticed the garage door was still open, just like the night before. But what she found inside the house would haunt her forever. As she entered, Connie was met with a scene so horrifying, it's unimaginable. Bruce's lifeless body lay at the foot of the stairs, surrounded by a pool of blood. His head was severely battered, and there was a deep, horrific cut across his throat. In shock, Connie rushed to a neighbor's house for help, and they quickly called 911. The police and emergency responders arrived soon after, but what they discovered inside the house was beyond belief. In the master bedroom, they found Deborah's body, her head horribly beaten, just like Bruce's. The deaths were already beyond shocking, but what they discovered in the children's room was even worse. There, little Melissa's body was found, beaten badly and stabbed. Her face was covered by a blanket, and there were clear signs of SA. It was a parent's worst nightmare, something no one could ever prepare for. But in the middle of the horror, there was a tiny flicker of hope. 3-year-old Vanessa, despite her terrible injuries, was still alive. She was rushed to the hospital, hanging on by the smallest thread. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. As Vanessa was rushed to the hospital, the investigators started to comb through the scene. What used to be a home full of love and laughter was now a place of terror and clues. Outside, they found Deborah's purse lying in the snow, clearly searched through by whoever did this. Nearby, a butcher knife from the family's kitchen was found, probably one of the weapons used in the attack. But the real weapon, the one that delivered the deadly blows, was still missing. And based on the injuries, the investigators believed a hammer might have been used. They carefully gathered fingerprints and other samples from various surfaces in the hope of finding something that could lead them to the killer. But there was one detail that stood out above the rest: bloodstained boot prints. Prints no one in the family recognized. This was someone new, someone who shouldn't have been there. To widen the search, authorities called in family members and close friends who had attended Melissa's birthday party earlier that day. They asked them to provide DNA samples, something that seemed strange at the time, but would later prove to be an important step. Genetic studies were still in their infancy back then, but the investigators knew they had to gather anything that could be useful down the line. As the investigation continued, specialists carefully preserved the victim's clothing and meticulously collected bits of carpet from beneath Melissa's body, a bedspread, and other items that could provide clues. Every scrap of evidence was carefully preserved, hoping that one small detail would crack the case open. Meanwhile, in the hospital, a team of medical professionals fought tirelessly to keep little Vanessa alive. At just 3 years old, she was in critical condition. The doctors reported that Vanessa had suffered severe injuries. Her jaw was shattered, her head severely injured, and her arms, hips, and legs were all broken. She had also been SA. It was nothing short of a miracle that she was still alive. She needed 3 units of blood and several more units of fluids, just to keep her stable. But despite all the efforts, the doctor's report to the family was devastating. The little girl was fighting for her life, and the outlook was uncertain. As the days dragged on, investigators began to realize something chilling. The attack on the Bennett family wasn't an isolated incident. Less than 2 weeks before that brutal night, there had been similar attacks in Colorado, one of them eerily close to home. On January 4th, Just days before the Bennetts were attacked, a young couple, James and Kimberly, had been ambushed in their home in Aurora. They were having a quiet night, Kimberly in the bedroom, while James was in another room recording music for a friend. Out of nowhere, Kimberly was struck in the head in the dark. She caught a brief glimpse of a man's silhouette before he fled when she screamed. James, hearing her scream, rushed to her side but was struck in the head by the same hammer-wielding attacker. Despite his injury, James managed to chase the assailant, but the attacker escaped into the night. Meanwhile, Kimberly was able to call 911 that night. Emergency services quickly arrived, and both James and Kimberly were transported to the hospital. James suffered a skull fracture, and Kimberly had a concussion, but they both eventually recovered. When the police investigated the scene, they found the hammer that had been used in the attack. It was clear that the attacker had entered the house through the garage, which had been left open. Fresh footprints in the snow led away from the house, but the trail eventually mixed with other tracks, and they lost the lead. However, the police did find Kimberly's purse in the snow, though it was missing only the money. Now if you thought that was the end of it, well, think again. Less than a week later, another shocking attack rocked the Colorado community. Patricia Smith, a 50-year-old woman who had recently moved from Nebraska, was there to help her daughter and her 2 young grandchildren settle into their new home. Patricia was well known for her grace, elegance, and impressive client list as an interior decorator, beloved by everyone who knew her. But on January 10, 1984, her life would be tragically cut short in the most horrifying way. It all started like any other day. Patricia took her daughter to the park so she could catch the bus to work, then dropped off the grandkids at daycare. Afterwards, she spent the morning working, picked up some laundry, and grabbed a quick hamburger for lunch. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But when Patricia arrived home, things quickly took a deadly turn. She went up to her room, turned on the TV, and then, for reasons unknown, headed back downstairs. That's when she came face to face with an intruder. Before she could even react, a savage attack unfolded right in her own living room, blows so brutal that they ended her life in a matter of seconds. That evening, around 5:30, Patricia's daughter, who had been waiting at the park for her mom to pick her up, started to panic when Patricia didn't show. She called home from a public phone, but no one picked up. Concerned, she reached out to a cousin who came to pick her up along with the kids. They headed home, but when they got there, something didn't feel right. The garage door was wide open, and inside, the TV was flickering in the dark house. As they made their way inside, they stumbled upon a scene so horrific it was almost impossible to process. There, in the living room, was Patricia's lifeless body, covered with a child's blanket, blood everywhere. Her pants and boots were scattered around, and her upper clothing was open, a chilling sign that another brutal assault had taken place. A hammer, the weapon used to kill her, lay beside her. The daughter, completely in shock, ran to a neighbor's house, hoping for some kind of confirmation that her mom was still alive. But it was too late. Patricia was gone, 911 was called, and soon the authorities arrived. The investigation into Patricia's death uncovered something truly chilling. 17 brutal blows to her head and clear signs of SA. The killer didn't stop there. After taking Patricia's life, he went upstairs, rifled through her purse, and stole money before fleeing the scene. Authorities turned to Patricia's circle of friends, family, and clients for answers, but no solid leads came through. On that very same day, January 10th, another woman became the target of a vicious attack. Her name was Donna, and she was a flight attendant for Frontier Airlines. That evening, she was off duty, waiting for her partner Ron, who was a pilot, to return from a night flight. She'd spent the evening picking up groceries, getting the mail, and parking her car in the garage. But as she stepped out of her vehicle, she was struck in the temple, knocking her out cold. The next morning, Ron returned home to find something that made his blood run cold. A trail of blood led from the garage to the house, and he rushed inside, following it to the bedroom. There, lying on the bed, was Donna, unconscious, with a severe head wound. Somehow, through all the pain, she had dragged herself to the bedroom. Ron immediately called 911, and Donna was rushed to the hospital, where doctors confirmed she had been assaulted. At first, was considered a suspect. After all, he had just returned from his flight, and the attack had happened only an hour before he arrived. But soon enough, investigators ruled him out. The search for the real killer was on. While going through Donna's car, they found a blood-soaked hammer in the driver's seat. They collected it as evidence, but frustratingly, no fingerprints were found. Despite the horrific injuries she had suffered, Donna managed to recover, though the head injury caused significant short-term memory loss. She couldn't remember the details of the attack, but in a way, she was relieved. She was just grateful to be alive. In fact, later on, the couple sat down for an interview, where Donna opened up about the aftermath of the brutal attack, saying, "I say I had the mentality of a 2-year-old. Everything was new to me. Once again, I didn't know a knife and fork. I couldn't even tell you that I can't open my mouth and how hard it is to eat." Now, with all of this being said, this hammer killer was one brazen individual. And just 6 days after the attack on Donna and Ron, and less than 25 miles away from their home, the brutal attack on the Bennett family unfolded. And throughout that heartbreaking January, while the families of the victims were in mourning, those who survived, like little Vanessa, were fighting for their lives and recovery. Vanessa's grandmother, Connie, never gave up hope, praying for the child's healing. Meanwhile, the investigation stretched on, with authorities collecting every bit of evidence they could find from the 4 crime scenes, including genetic material, footprints, and anything else that might point to the killer. But once again, forensic science in the 1980s wasn't nearly as advanced as it is today. DNA analysis was still in its early stages, and investigators were working with limited tools. The attacks took place in both Aurora and Lakewood, leading local police to share information. However, despite their efforts, no useful fingerprints were discovered at the crime scenes, or even on the hammers used during the attacks. As the investigation continued, the FBI brought in a profiler to help understand the mind of the killer. The profiler suggested that the attacker wasn't targeting specific victims, but was more of an opportunist, roaming neighborhoods and looking for easy access, like open garage doors. Once he found his way inside, his attacks were swift, violent, and deadly, often followed by sexual assault and theft. Based on the patterns, the profiler estimated that the killer was likely a young man, around 20 years old, smart, but not highly educated. He might have finished high school, but not gone to college. The repeated use of hammers and a distinctive boot print at one scene suggested the man might be working in construction, especially since many homes were being built in the areas where the crimes occurred. But here's the real kicker. The profiler believed this guy wasn't going to stop until he was caught. So investigators went to construction sites, talked to contractors, and tried to find anyone who had noticed something strange. Unfortunately, contractor records were messy, and there wasn't much to go on. Because the attacks were sudden and always happened in the dark, no one had seen the attacker clearly. As the investigation continued with no new leads, the community was on edge. People became extra cautious, locking up their garages and doors like never before. Some even started buying guns or wearing helmets to bed. But time passed without any more attacks, and eventually the police had to move on to other cases, leaving these brutal crimes unsolved. Interestingly, in the year 1990, investigators stumbled upon something unexpected: one single blonde pubic hair. They immediately sent it for specialized analysis, hoping that this might finally be the clue they had been waiting for. But then again, the technology back then wasn't as advanced as it is today, and the test ended up destroying the hair before they could gather any useful information. This was a massive setback, but the investigators refused to give up. Fast forward to 2001, 17 years after the horrific attacks. The breakthrough that everyone had been hoping for finally arrived when the DNA samples were fully identified, clearing family members from suspicion. But even with this significant progress, the mystery was far from over. Then in 2018, the investigation took another turn. This time, detectives teamed up with a genealogist, hoping she could provide the breakthrough they needed. They used the DNA sequence to search through both public and private databases. Just 1 week later, the genealogist gave them a huge piece of the puzzle. She found a match to someone with the last name Ewing. This discovery was massive, but it wasn't the end of the road. The detectives quickly discovered there were several individuals with the last name Ewing living in Colorado, but none of them seemed to fit the profile. They weren't giving up though. They expanded the search, digging through Aurora's database and finding a total of 40 individuals with that surname. While juggling other cases, the detectives meticulously analyzed each of these individuals, holding on to hope that one of them would be the missing link. Then in July of 2018, everything clicked. After months of hard work, they discovered a match with an inmate in Nevada, Alex Ewing. Born on August 14, 1960, in North Carolina, little was known about his childhood, but it was clear that Alex had a troubled past. He dropped out of school after the 10th grade, claiming he was expelled for excessive drinking. This marked the start of a chaotic life that spiraled into crime. From a young age, Alex's life was marred by brushes with the law. He was detained in a juvenile center in Sacramento, California for theft, and was later placed in a foster home. But his time in the foster system was short-lived. He stayed just 2 weeks before being released. His criminal activities didn't stop there. He continued a path of theft, burglary, and even escape, moving from California to Arizona to Florida. By 1983, Alex had secured a driver's license and was living in Denver, Colorado, the same place where the attacks occurred in early 1984, leaving 4 dead and several others severely injured. After the attack stopped, Alex seemed to vanish from Colorado, but he didn't go far. He moved to Kingman, Arizona, where on January 27, 1984, he broke into a home and attacked Roy Williams with a heavy granite rock, striking him in the head and chest. Roy miraculously survived, but required over 100 stitches. Roy was able to provide a partial description of his attacker, and later that same day, a police officer spotted a man hiding in the bushes near an interstate on-ramp. The officer approached, but Alex fled, leading to a brief but intense chase. On February 2, 1984, Alex was finally apprehended. Alex Ewing was formally charged with attempted first-degree murder and first-degree robbery. He was being held in jail in Utah, but in early August 1984, something shocking happened. While being transported with several other inmates for a court hearing, Alex made a bold escape. He managed to slip away from the authorities during a stop at a service station, wearing nothing but red shorts and an orange jumpsuit. It was around 10 p.m. when police received reports of a suspicious man in red shorts running through a nearby neighborhood. The hunt was on. An hour later, panic set in when Nancy Berry called 911 in a desperate voice, claiming she and her husband had been attacked. Nancy and Chris Berry were found severely injured in their bed. Alex had broken into their home through an open garage door and savagely attacked them with an axe handle. Miraculously, their children were unharmed. A massive manhunt ensued, but Alex was still on the run. 4 days later, Alex was spotted at a phone booth, apparently calling his brother for help. He tried to flee, but by then he was weakened and dehydrated. Police caught up with him, and Alex was back in custody. This time, he faced a mountain of charges: attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, robbery, and escape. He was sentenced to 110 years in prison. But the story didn't end there. Alex had been at large for less than 8 months after the attacks in Colorado, but those months were just the beginning of a long, twisted journey. Fast forward to July 2018. A team of Colorado police and prosecutors traveled to the Northern Nevada Correctional Center to interview Alex. They approached him pretending to be non-law enforcement officers, keeping the focus off the Colorado crimes for now. They knew they had the breakthrough they needed: the DNA match from the Bennett and Patricia crime scenes. This was the moment they had been waiting for, but they had to play it smart. During the interview, Alex spoke candidly about his past. He claimed his father had been in the Air Force and discussed his troubled history, mentioning an illness, spinal meningitis, that had nearly killed him, causing a drastic change in his behavior. He also admitted to spending some time working in construction in Colorado, particularly in Aurora and Lakewood, before leaving because it was too cold. This was a crucial detail. It confirmed Alex's presence in Colorado at the time of the attacks. The next day, detectives returned to meet with Alex. This time, they showed him 6 black and white photos of the crimes in Colorado. Initially, Alex denied knowing any of the victims, but when shown a color photo of Patricia alive, he stuck to his story. However, when the detectives presented him with a color photo of Patricia's lifeless body, Alex's demeanor changed. He became visibly agitated, insisting there must have been some mistake. In a panic, he immediately requested a lawyer. What Alex hadn't anticipated was how the tides had turned after all these years. After 34 years behind bars, Alex had been preparing documents to request parole. He was confident he could be released after serving 40 years. In fact, he even set up a profile on a dating site, fully expecting his freedom. But this meeting shattered his hopes. The detectives now had the evidence they needed. With the confirmation of the DNA match, Colorado detectives returned to court and secured a court order for another cheek swab from Alex. The results were undeniable. The DNA from the Bennett and Patricia crime scenes matched his. It was finally over. Police began notifying the families and survivors of the 1984 attacks that they had found the person responsible. Justice was on the horizon, but it wouldn't come easily. The first step was to request Alex's extradition from Nevada to Colorado for trial. The first hearing took place on October 2, 2018, and Alex was informed he would have to face the charges in Colorado. But Alex wasn't going down without a fight. He informed the judge he planned to contest the extradition. Over the next 16 months, his lawyer filed appeal after appeal, trying to delay the inevitable. As the legal battle continued, Colorado prosecutors faced a tough challenge. Some of the crimes were too old to be prosecuted because they didn't have a fatal outcome and the statute of limitations had passed. But there was hope. Alex could still be tried for the family and Patricia. Back in 1984, the law allowed life without parole for such crimes, as the death penalty wasn't an option. In February 2020, the Nevada Supreme Court ordered Alex's transfer to Colorado. As mentioned earlier, his lawyer fought hard to delay the move, but the U.S. Supreme Court rejected the appeal. A few days later, Alex was on a plane to Colorado, ready to face the charges. The trial for the Bennett family case began in July 2021. The prosecution had a solid case. They presented DNA evidence showing Alex's presence at the crime scenes, especially near the body of Melissa Bennett. They drew chilling comparisons between the Bennett family attack and Patricia's murder. Both involved hammer attacks, sexual assault, and victims found in disturbing positions. In both cases, the attacker entered through open garages and the victims' purses were nearby. The defense tried to poke holes in the investigation, claiming mishandled DNA samples and a lack of fingerprints. But the prosecution fired back, suggesting Alex wore gloves during the attack. The courtroom heard from police, firefighters, and specialists, but the most emotional moment came from Connie Bennett, Bruce's mother. She described finding the gruesome crime scene at her son's house, and the jury was shown photos of the aftermath. After just 3.5 hours of deliberation, the jury sent a note to the judge saying they were deadlocked. The prosecution asked the judge to keep the jury working while the defense pushed for a mistrial. The judge decided to hold off on a mistrial and told the jury to return the next day. After 6 more hours, they finally reached a verdict. Alex was found guilty of 3 counts of murder, robbery, and other charges. At the sentencing, family members of the victims gave emotional impact statements. When asked if he had anything to say, Alex simply responded, "No thank you." With that breaking news from the courtroom, guilty on all counts. That is the verdict in a 37-year-old murder case. The defendant killed 3 members of the Bennett family in Aurora with a hammer. A little girl was the only survivor. The judge, disgusted by Alex's actions, sentenced him to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The trial for Patricia's murder started in October 2021, but was declared a mistrial after Alex's defense requested a mental competency evaluation. The evaluation confirmed Alex was fit to stand trial, and after more delays, the trial for Patricia's murder began in April 2022. This time, Alex couldn't stay quiet. He complained about being extradited from Nevada and claimed the system was rigged. Despite his protests, the result was the same. Another life sentence. A man already serving 3 life sentences received another one today. A Jefferson County jury convicted Alex Ewing last week of sexually assaulting and murdering Patricia Smith in 1984. Through all of this, Vanessa, the only surviving member of the Bennett family, had to relive the trauma. She shared her story of how the attack left her physically and mentally scarred. She spent years battling depression, addiction, and the pain of her past. After years of struggle, she finally decided to stop being a victim. Vanessa got clean, settled down, and started a new life. But she said the capture of her attacker brought her no peace. For her, the damage had already been done. What did they do wrong? They didn't do anything. They were young. They were in their mid-20s. Are you hopeful about the future? I am. I had big things planned, and I know it sounds like it's a little late because I'm 38 years old, but it's never too late. Now, as we mentioned in the intro, while justice can't bring back the lives lost, it does bring some peace to the families affected. Hopefully, Alex will face the consequences of his actions and suffer in prison for the rest of his life. Story 3. This photo from 1990 shows a father and son looking happy and proud, known back then as the owners of one of Australia's top stud farms. They raised award-winning Corriedale sheep, and their lives seemed picture-perfect. But just 2 years later, that perfect picture shattered. 7 gunshots ended both their lives, including a woman who lived with them, in a shocking murder that would reveal some jaw-dropping secrets about the father in that very photo. Now, while looking into this case, I realize not much has been said about it over the years. The media barely touched it, and information is scarce. But one person changed everything. Bob Perry, the father's secret lover for over a decade. Turns out, there was a whole other side to his life, one full of secrets and drama that no one saw coming. The reason behind the murders wasn't simple. And just like always, we're about to piece together the clues and dive deep into the secrets that led to the tragic deaths of the Wettenhall family. For starters, the main focus of this story is Darcy Wettenhall. When the murders took place, Darcy was already in his 50s, and at that time, his son Guy Wettenhall was about 23. Darcy had made a name for himself as an incredibly talented sheep breeder, and in the world of sheep farming, he was considered a bit of a legend. His reputation was well known, and he was highly respected for his work. However, when we take a closer look at his past, especially his childhood, we begin to see that things weren't as perfect as they seemed. It turns out Darcy didn't have the fairy tale upbringing people might have assumed. His childhood was marked by hardship, and while not much was known about the details, there are enough clues to paint a picture of someone who faced a tough and troubled start. For one, Darcy had a tendency to run away, and not just once or twice. He left home pretty early, trying to escape to the city, but it's unclear exactly what drove him there. Some people believe he was running away from the abuse he faced at home, especially from his mother. Others think he was just after some kind of adventure, something bigger and different from the life he had known. Whatever the real story is, it's obvious that Darcy's younger years were filled with turmoil, confusion, and a lot of running away. What's interesting about Darcy is that he had this complicated personality that made him both hard to understand and hard to forget. On one hand, he could be incredibly generous, offering kindness and help when you least expected it. But on the other hand, he had this darker side. People who knew him would often describe him as being cruel and quick-tempered, especially when things didn't go his way. By the time Darcy hit his teenage years, things had taken a pretty big turn. He ended up living with his cousins, Rupert and Janet Wettenhall. Now, Rupert and Janet weren't just any regular relatives. They were the ones who owned the stud farms that Darcy would eventually inherit. And this wasn't just a small farm either. The Wettenhall family's stud farm, Stanbury, located on Devon Road in Ceres, Victoria, was a massive deal in Australia. The farm had been in the family since 1951, when Rupert and Janet had bought it. They had put in the hard work and dedication to make Stanbury one of the most respected and well-known stud farms in the country. The farm became famous for breeding world-class, award-winning Corriedale sheep. They weren't just any sheep. These sheep were the kind that made a name for themselves, not just locally, but internationally. Sadly, Rupert Wettenhall passed away on July 25, 1962, while he was in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He had been there on an international trip, trying to sell his prized sheep to overseas buyers. It's a tragic turn of events, but it also meant that the farm and all of its legacy was passed on to his family, including Darcy. Now, as you might expect, Darcy eventually found himself stepping into his cousin Rupert's shoes, taking up the mantle and continuing the legacy of the Wettenhall family. And during this time, Janet, his cousin Rupert's widow, was still very much alive and living with Darcy. And it wasn't long before Darcy married someone who he thought was the love of his life, Jan MacDonald. But here's the twist. Their marriage wasn't the fairy tale you'd imagined. In fact, if you were to call it anything, it was probably more of a nightmare. The truth is, Darcy's motivations in life were deeply rooted in his desire to climb the social ladder, to prove that he could move in circles far above where he had come from. He wanted to marry the right woman, someone who could elevate his status and help him cement his place in high society. And that's exactly what he thought he was doing when he married January. But despite everything he thought he wanted, Darcy was never truly cut out for marriage, and he certainly wasn't kind to women. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Now would later claim that Darcy was abusive, both physically and mentally. She described him as a cruel man, capable of telling outrageous lies without a second thought. But despite the harshness of their marriage, they did have a son together, Guy Wettenhall, born in 1968. But things didn't stay smooth for long. When Guy was only 2 years old, Jan had finally had enough, and decided to leave Stanbury, taking her son with her. But in a surprising twist, Darcy actually managed to gain custody of their son. This wasn't a common occurrence back then. It wasn't typical for a father to gain full custody, especially when the mother was still alive and involved in the child's life. So how did he pull it off? It wasn't by accident. Darcy had a plan. While Jan was studying nursing, Darcy swooped in and took control. Guy, who had been staying with his grandparents, was taken from Jan's care. It was a sneaky, and some would say dastardly move. Was left powerless, unable to do much to stop it. But that wasn't the end of it. Once Darcy had custody of Guy, things took an even darker turn. Jan would later recall how, when she tried to visit her son at Stanbury, Darcy would always have an excuse. He'd say that Guy couldn't see her because he was out at football or pony club. It became clear to Jan that Darcy wasn't just keeping Guy away from her. He was actively trying to keep them apart. Over time, Jan began to believe that Darcy was deliberately turning their son against her, and her suspicions only grew stronger as Guy got older. By the time Guy was 13, the damage was done. He cut off all contact with Jan and never spoke to her again. No matter how much she tried, she never got the chance to rebuild her relationship with her son. And Darcy wasn't just cruel to his wife. He had a rocky relationship with pretty much all the women in his life. Many people have pointed out that even his cousin Rupert's wife, Janet, wasn't spared from his harsh treatment. Interestingly, from the moment he married, Darcy's only goal was to have a son, never a daughter. Some people have speculated that his issues with women had something to do with internalized misogyny. After all, Darcy grew up during a time when traditional gender roles were heavily enforced. Men were expected to be tough, unemotional, and dominant, while women were mostly seen as caretakers and housewives. So it makes sense that Darcy's attitudes might have been shaped by these old-school ideas. But it's also possible that his problems went deeper. When you look at his life, it becomes pretty clear that Darcy struggled with his own identity, especially when it came to his sexuality. Back in the 1950s and 60s, when homosexuality was illegal and frowned upon, men like Darcy were forced to hide their true selves. In fact, a lot of people who were attracted to the same sex during that time had to bury those feelings deep down, sometimes even denying them to themselves. Darcy may have been one of those men. His behavior, especially toward women, could have been a reflection of his inner turmoil. Now, if you're wondering what Darcy was like as a father, well, it's a bit complicated. On the outside, he seemed like he was giving his son, Guy, everything a boy could want. Private school education, horses, ponies, ski trips in the winter, you name it. It wasn't that Darcy didn't provide for his son. In fact, he did, but in his own way. The thing is, it wasn't about love or affection. It was all part of Darcy's vision for his son, a vision that Guy didn't have a choice but to follow. At this point in time, Bob Perry, a longtime neighbor of Darcy's, had also been secretly in a relationship with him. Just like Darcy, Bob was married with 2 kids, and back then, being gay wasn't exactly something people would openly talk about. They both had to hide their true identities, keeping their relationship a secret, even from their own families. A year after Bob and his wife parted ways, Darcy stepped in to support Bob, offering him a home and a job at Stanbury. In fact, there's a photo of Bob and his children living at Darcy's property, where Bob also served as Guy's co-executor. Then in early 1991, things started to shift. Bob reached a point where he wanted to live his life openly as a proud gay man, but Darcy wasn't on board with that at all. So Bob made the tough decision to leave. He was a bank manager and got transferred to different branches, which meant he could easily commute between Melbourne and where they were living. But the more time Bob spent away from Darcy, the more he realized that he could actually be much happier in a new environment. Along the way, Bob found someone else he fell for. Even though that person didn't feel as strongly about him as he had hoped, it was still enough to make him take the leap and move to Melbourne to be closer to this new love. Once he was far enough from Darcy, he realized that he didn't want to stay stuck in such a toxic situation anymore. It's also important to note that Darcy and Bob had been in a relationship for 10 years, a whole decade of shared lives, struggles, and secret moments. So when Bob decided to walk away, it hit Darcy hard. It wasn't just the fact that Bob had moved on and was now living as a free man, but also that Darcy was still hiding who he truly was, and that left him feeling lost and empty. He couldn't ignore the fact that he was still stuck in a life of pretending, while Bob had finally chosen to live openly and freely. After Bob left, Darcy sought comfort in all the wrong places. He found himself flirting with young homeless men in Melbourne, often picking them up from Gill Memorial Home for Men. This shelter, though long gone, used to be a place for men who had just come out of prison. It was a temporary home for those trying to rebuild their lives. Darcy would offer them food, a place to sleep, and sometimes work on his farm, but his intentions weren't exactly pure. While he did help these men, there was another side to his actions. He was drawn to younger men, and it seemed like part of Darcy's self-loathing pushed him toward men who were troubled or in difficult situations. Some even say that he was drawn to men he could manipulate or control, whether that was through their vulnerabilities or his position of power. And that's when he met 23-year-old Wayne Gary Walton. Wayne wasn't just any young man. His background was heartbreaking and dark. At the age of 11, Wayne had witnessed his own father murder his 7-year-old sister right in front of their mother. His father, who had just gotten out of prison, had believed that his wife was having an affair with one of the men from the prison, and that belief drove him to commit this unspeakable act. Some people say that Wayne's relationship with his father wasn't just tragic because of what he witnessed, but also because he was a victim of abuse from his father at an early age. That kind of trauma doesn't just disappear. It shapes who you become. The violence and pain Wayne endured growing up became a part of him, influencing his choices and actions as he got older. Now, the reason Wayne ended up in prison before Darcy even picked him up is because of theft. It wasn't a minor thing. Wayne had a history of getting into trouble. According to Wayne, Darcy first offered him a job and a place to stay, which seemed like a decent deal at the time. But just a few days later, Wayne claimed that Darcy made a sexual advance toward him. From there, things got even more complicated. While not much is known about the 4 months they spent together, one thing is certain. They were in a relationship, but it wasn't your typical romantic setup. If you're thinking that Wayne and Darcy had a sweet, loving relationship, you might want to rethink that. Sure, they were together for a few months, but their connection wasn't based on love or care. It was all about power and manipulation. Wayne actually had the upper hand because he knew Darcy's deepest secret, his hidden sexuality. That gave Wayne a major advantage. He could use that information to control Darcy. And there was a darker side to this relationship too. Blackmail played a role. He knew how to push Darcy's buttons, and he wasn't shy about using that power to get what he wanted. What made the situation even more complicated was Wayne's upbringing in an abusive and violent household. That kind of environment doesn't just teach you to survive. It teaches you to fight back when someone tries to dominate you. So when Darcy attempted to control or belittle Wayne, it triggered something deep inside him. This might have been what transpired on March 18, 1992. It was a day that started like any other, but quickly spiraled into a nightmare. During a heated argument, Wayne Walton snapped. Fueled by amphetamines and months of building tension, he grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun and killed Darcy Wettenhall and his son, Guy Wettenhall. But it didn't stop there. Remember, 81-year-old Janet Wettenhall, Darcy's cousin and Rupert's wife, was also living with them at the time. Tragically, she became another victim of Wayne's violent outburst. The next day, Wayne was apprehended by police. He was found driving a stolen car with stolen items from the Wettenhall family's farm in his possession. It wasn't long before he was charged with 3 counts of murder. But the horror didn't end there. As shocking as murders were, what came next rocked the entire country. As mentioned earlier, Darcy was a well-known figure in Australia and had been the center of attention for years. So naturally, his death made headlines everywhere. But just a few weeks after his death, the post-mortem results were released, and they uncovered something that no one saw coming. Darcy had been HIV positive. In a time when HIV was still shrouded in fear and uncertainty, this revelation was a bombshell. People were terrified of the virus, and the stigma surrounding it was at its peak. Many, including Bob, had suspected that Darcy knew something was wrong with his health, but had kept it hidden. After all, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, being diagnosed with HIV usually meant a life expectancy of no more than 3 years. Though Darcy was in his early 50s, he was no spring chicken, and his health had been steadily declining. Bob recalls how Darcy often had terrible night sweats, a common early symptom of HIV at the time. He also had rashes and was a heavy smoker, which didn't help his situation. But Darcy, true to form, kept everything to himself. But why did Wayne kill Guy and Janet, along with Darcy? Some believe that deep down, Wayne was trying to eliminate the hypocrisy and privilege that he saw around him. He might have viewed the Wettenhall family as symbols of everything wrong in the world, the perfect, well-off family who lived in a world he could never access. In his twisted mindset, taking them out could have seemed like a way to make things right. But of course, Wayne was under the influence of amphetamines at the time, which clouds any sort of rational thinking. So his reasoning likely wasn't clear or even fully coherent. A year later, on February 22, 1993, took his own life in a tragic and chilling turn of events. While waiting for his trial for the murders, he committed self-harm by hanging himself with a television cable in the management and supervision section of Pentridge Prison's B Division. If there had been a trial, we might have learned much more about Wayne's troubled life, his motivations, and the dark undercurrents that led to the murders. But he never made it to court, taking his own life before facing any legal consequences. The potential for deeper investigation and more shocking revelations died with him. The aftermath of the murders wasn't just a personal tragedy. It marked the end of an era for the Wettenhall family. Their once thriving stud farm operations were brought to a halt. The Stanbury property, which had been so closely tied to the family's legacy, was auctioned off in December of 1992. It was purchased by former Royal Agricultural Society of Victoria President Stephen Spargo and his wife, Jill, who took over what had once been Darcy's domain. After the shootings, Bob couldn't shake the guilt that hit him hard. He'd never really talked about his relationship with Darcy. But one day, a chat with Neil Drennan, a journalist and bookseller from Cailleach, sparked something in him. Bob, now living in the outway south of Cailleach, was a big fan of reading and regularly stopped by Drennan's bookshop, Cailleach. One day, he casually told Drennan, "I've got a story you can write." That conversation eventually led to Drennan's true crime book, The Devil's Grip, a true story of shame, sheep and shotguns, which tells the story of the Wettenhall family. According to Bob, he carried a huge weight of unnecessary guilt over the murders. He felt like he was responsible, like he had left the gate open and let the devil in, even though he had always tried to protect Darcy, Guy, and Janet. But after Bob stepped away, everything started to fall apart. The book dives into the shame, fear, and hidden lives in conservative rural areas where being gay was so out of the norm that people would joke you'd been kicked in the head by a horse. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Story 4. The Eastburns were a happy military family, Gary, Catherine, and their 3 children, and their lives were about to change for the better, or so they thought. The family had plans to relocate to England, but what was supposed to be a new chapter in their lives turned into an unimaginable nightmare when one man decided to tear the family apart. Today we'll unravel the horror that took place in the days leading up to Mother's Day, 1985, and how it's still going to this day. Catherine Eastburn grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, and was no stranger to changes and challenges. She had a quiet life, but she never could have imagined how the future would change her and her family. In the 1970s, Katie would have a life-changing moment at a softball game of all places, where she met Gary Eastburn, a young man who caught her eye and stole her heart. They connected instantly, and their relationship began to blossom. It was love at first sight. By 1975, they were married shortly after Gary enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, which would shape their future. The couple's family grew quickly. In 1979, they welcomed their first daughter, Kara, followed by Erin in 1981, and then, in 1983, Jana completed the family. By the time their third daughter arrived, Gary had achieved the rank of captain in the Air Force, and his military career really took off from there. He was stationed at Pope Air Force Base in Fayetteville, North Carolina. The Eastburn family settled into a very secure life, with Gary being a military man. Things were moving along smoothly for the Eastburns as they prepared for the next big chapter of their lives. In 1985, Gary received an assignment to be stationed in England, which would be the biggest step forward in his career. But it meant that Katie would be left behind to pack up their life and make do for the time being. As Gary began a 10-week officer training course at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, Katie stayed in Fayetteville with the children, handling the family as a mother of 3 beautiful daughters. There was a lot to get ready for, securing the house, the paperwork, and finding a way to find a new home for their dog Dixie, because pets weren't allowed to travel to England. Katie put out an ad to find Dixie a new family, which would change the Eastburns' lives forever. What Katie didn't know was that the stranger responding to her ad would play a big role in the horrifying events that were about to unfold. In 1985, as Gary prepared to leave for his officer training at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, the family faced the reality of their upcoming relocation to England. The logistical details required attention, so there was more to it than just packing their things. They had to go through a ton of paperwork. Gary would be away for weeks, and Katie supported her husband's career and was left to manage the heavy burden of organizing everything for the move. The plan was for the family to reunite in England, but for now, it was just Katie and the 3 young children in Fayetteville. The biggest issue on Katie's mind was dealing with Dixie, the family's dog. Pets weren't allowed on the flight to England, and so Katie had no choice but to find Dixie a new home. It was a difficult decision, but she had to make it. But finding a new home for their 5th family member would bring her face to face with a man who would later be at the center of a horrific crime. While Katie managed these responsibilities, Gary's absence in Alabama was, at this point, the norm in their busy lives. His career had always been a priority, and the family had adjusted to the demands of military life. Gary's promotion to captain had brought them to Fayetteville in the first place, and the upcoming assignment to England was a big step forward. Katie supported her husband's ambitions, but it was clear that their family life was about to change in ways neither of them could have anticipated. She met Timothy Hennis. Hennis was a sergeant in the Army, living in the same Fayetteville area. He had been married to his wife, Angela, for a few years and had a young daughter, Christina. Hennis, like many young men, was trying to make a name for himself, balancing family life with the demands of his Army duties. His life was ordinary until he responded to Katie's ad about Dixie. What followed next would be a series of small, seemingly innocent encounters that would become tragic in the most unimaginable way. On May 7, 1985, Hennis responded to Katie's ad and came to the Eastburn home to meet Dixie. Katie invited him inside, showing him the dog. He and his wife Angela loved dogs, but their current pet, Snowball, a mixed breed, was struggling to adjust to their newborn daughter. Despite their best efforts, Snowball was jealous of the baby, so Hennis and Angela knew they needed a dog that could thrive in a home with a young child. They hoped to find a dog that Christina could grow with and enjoy. Dixie seemed to be the perfect fit. Before he left the Eastburn home, Hennis politely asked to use the restroom, and Katie obliged, and with that he left Katie's house, unaware that he was about to go on a very dark path. At that moment, Katie couldn't have known that this encounter with Hennis would be one of the last peaceful days of her life. There was nothing to suggest that this harmless interaction would lead to tragedy. Katie had no reason to suspect anything other than that Hennis would simply be another man who was now the proud owner of a new dog. As Hennis left Katie's home with Dixie, the Eastburn family's life continued as planned. Gary was away at his officer training in Alabama, and Katie was busy with preparations for their move. The events that would follow were set in motion by this simple interaction. The evening of May 9, 1985, began like any other in the Eastburn home. Katie had spent the day taking care of her 3 young daughters, Kara, Erin, and Jana. But as night fell, the family's lives were changed. By the early morning hours of May 10th, Katie, Erin, and Kara were found brutally murdered. Katie was assaulted and sustained multiple stab wounds. Erin and Kara had their lives cut short and also suffered fatal injuries. Despite the brutality of the crime, the scene seemed undisturbed at first. The front door was locked, but neighbors noticed a pile of newspapers outside the house, indicating that no one had collected them for several days. By the evening of May 10th, Gary started getting concerned because his wife wasn't calling him like she usually would. So he contacted the Fayetteville Police Department. Officers responded the next day, but found no immediate signs of foul play. They left a note for Katie, hoping for a simple explanation. But the family had already been murdered. No one knew what exactly had happened, but on Sunday, May 12th, their neighbor, Army Sergeant Bob Seafelt, returned home to find his wife concerned after bailing out a soldier who had overindulged the previous night. She had noticed newspapers piling up on the Eastburn's doorstep. Their car was still in the driveway, and the baby's stroller was at the back door. This was when police discovered Katie, Erin, and Kara lying lifeless, victims of a brutal and senseless attack. Little Jana was alone in her crib, covered in filth and severely dehydrated, but she was the only one who survived. Katie, Erin, and Kara were found brutally murdered. Their throats were slit. Jana was just 22 months old at the time, trapped for 3 agonizing days. So Bob decided to pay a visit and heard what he believed to be an infant crying, but nobody was responding at the front door as he knocked and rang the doorbell. He called the Eastburns babysitter, Julie Cherniak, who arrived shortly after. She looked through the window and noticed it was baby Jana crying alone in her crib. While her instinct was to immediately enter the house one way or the other, Bob asked her to wait for the police. Officer William Toman was the first to arrive. He retrieved Jana and a stack of diapers after forcing open a window and handed her over to Bob so he could investigate the scene. As he went through the house, the officer discovered the lifeless bodies of Katie and her 3-year-old daughter, Erin, and immediately called for backup. A deeper search of the house led to the discovery of 5-year-old Kara, lifeless on her bed. At this point, everybody had the same question on their mind. Why would anyone kill a beautiful young mother and her 2 daughters? Considering that this was a military family, the discovery of the crime had to lead to an intense investigation. On the night of the discovery, the task of piecing together the events was left to detectives Robert Biddle and Jack Watts of the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office. They scoured the Eastburn home for any sign of the killer. Among the clues found were fingerprints and hair samples. A luminol test revealed evidence of a botched cleanup attempt. Someone had tried to scrub the walls and bathroom, but the stains couldn't be hidden. As Gary helped the investigators, he noticed missing items, including Katie's ATM card, $300 in cash, and a piece of paper with her ATM password written on it. It was a janitor named Patrick Cohn who would provide the first breakthrough in the investigation. Cohn approached Robert and Jack, claiming he'd seen a tall white man in jeans and a black members-only jacket leaving the Eastburns driveway in the early morning hours of May 10th. The man was carrying a garbage bag, and Patrick remembered the car being a white Chevrolet Chevette. His account narrowed the timeline, giving investigators a window for the murders. They took place between 8 p.m. on May 9th and 3rd and on May 10th. While investigators were searching the house for clues to identify the killer, a young man named Patrick Cohn came forward with information that would prove to be important for the case. He reported that he had seen a man leaving the house in the early hours of May 10th, the night of the murders. Patrick was walking home from his girlfriend's house around 3:30 a.m. the night of the murder when he saw the white Chevette parked on the road. A man was walking down the driveway of the Eastburn home, and as he passed him, all he said was, "I'm getting an early start this morning." He then watched him get in his car and drive off. Patrick gave the authorities a detailed description of the man. He was approximately 6 feet 4 inches, with blonde hair peeking out from under a black knit hat. With this new piece of information that would later prove to be vital to solving the triple homicide, police issued a public appeal via television and radio. They requested the man who had answered the Eastburns classified ad about the dog to contact them. This plea was accompanied by a composite sketch created from Patrick's description of the man he had seen leaving the Eastburn residence. Despite these leads, the investigation stalled as investigators scrambled for more information. But the case started to make sense when investigators realized Hennis had been involved with the Eastburn family shortly before the murders, so he became a potential suspect. The case drew a lot of media attention, and by May 15th, Hennis walked into the Fayetteville police station and submitted to interrogation with Biddle and Watts. His account was straightforward. He had picked up the Eastburn family dog on May 7th, but had no further contact with Katie, claiming he spoke to her on the phone. Just once on May 9th to check on Dixie. According to Hennis, after that call, he drove his wife and daughter to his in-laws' house and returned home after refueling his car, but this alibi would soon begin to unravel. Hennis and Angela returned home, believing they had fully cooperated with the investigation. Investigators collected more than just Hennis' testimony. They took blood, saliva, hair, finger and palm prints from him, and a photo lineup led to an identifying moment when Cohn picked out Hennis as the man he'd seen near the Eastburns' home. Things got even more complicated when it was discovered that Katie's stolen ATM card had been used on the night of May 10th and the morning of May 11th. The total amount withdrawn was $300, which was the exact amount that was stolen from Katie's wallet. Investigators, who were aware of Hennis' history with bad checks and late rent payments, also learned that a female witness had seen a blonde man matching Hennis' description near the ATM shortly after the second transaction, and Hennis' landlord received $300 in overdue rent shortly after the murders, furthering the suspicion that Hennis had financial motives for the crime. By May 1985, Hennis had become the prime suspect, and authorities began to watch his every move, but no physical evidence had yet linked him to the murders. It was all just circumstantial evidence. No one involved. Not the police, Gary, or the neighbors could have expected that this case would occupy courtrooms for the next quarter of a century. There were plenty more inconsistencies with his story. Hennis' alibi about dropping his family off at his in-laws' place was contradicted when his former girlfriend, Nancy Mazur, came forward, claiming he had visited her unexpectedly that same night. Then there was the black member's only jacket Hennis had brought to the dry cleaner on May 10th, which was further proof of his link to the crime. And neighbors recalled seeing him burning items in a barrel the morning after the murders. Each new piece of evidence made it harder to ignore the case against him. Later that evening, the police arrived at Hennis' doorstep with an arrest warrant. Hennis immediately called on the services of Beaver, Holt, Richardson, Sternlicht, Burge, and Glazier, one of the most famous law firms in Fayetteville. Jerry Beaver and Billy Richardson, two of the firm's best lawyers, were brought in who were known as the best in the business when it came to criminal defense throughout the state. And they wasted no time. They immediately hired private investigator Bob Nelliger to review the police investigation independently, examine the evidence, and search for any overlooked clues because the authorities were closing in. Hennis eventually got arrested with charges of physical assault and triple homicide. The evidence against him, however, was circumstantial, and prosecutors would need more than just suspicions to secure a conviction. The trial began in 1986, and it was clear that the case wouldn't be easy, especially not against the kind of lawyers Hennis had hired. The prosecution focused on circumstantial evidence, claiming Hennis killed the Eastburn family to cover up allegedly assaulting Katie. The timeline was clear, with the witness who had seen a tall, blond man leaving the house with a trash bag, now identified as Hennis, the culprit. The defense, however, was quick to attack the case. They questioned the accuracy of the eyewitness testimony, attempting to poke holes in the identifications. They even went as far as to recreate the crime scene to demonstrate inconsistencies in the reports. The defense also argued that there was a lack of direct evidence linking Hennis to the crime. Their first idea was to stage a reenactment to prove that Patrick's eyewitness testimony couldn't be right. They brought in a guy who looked like Hennis and went to the Eastburn house that same morning around 3:30 a.m., just like Patrick had seen it, and they brought a camera, but the other guy couldn't see a thing, because it's usually very foggy that time of the night. Nelliger kept digging deeper to prove that their client was innocent, and found that the hair and fingerprints didn't add up because nothing matched Hennis, including the shoe prints the officers found at the scene, which were too small for a guy his size. Then their forensic expert, Stambaugh, found a condom wrapper under the dresser that the cops completely missed. This was to prove that the semen sample they found on Mrs. Eastburn could have easily been linked to Gary instead of Hennis. Nelliger wrapped things up by talking to Charlotte Kirby, the newspaper lady who didn't give them much, just that it was raining that morning and she had to bag the papers. Finally, he talked to the neighbors, the Rat Keys, who said they were out walking that morning and didn't see anyone. But a few nights later, they saw the same guy Patrick did. Blonde hair, black beret, a members-only jacket, walking down the street with a garbage bag. But no matter what Hennis' legal team did, the cops weren't convinced because they knew it was Hennis who did it after the evidence and witness reports started piling up. As the trial progressed, the jury was shown horrifying photos of the crime scene to highlight the brutality of the murders. The prosecution's case seemed strong, but without a smoking gun, the verdict was far from guaranteed. After what felt like forever, the jury found him guilty on July 4, 1986, on 1 count of first-degree rape and 3 counts of first-degree murder. Hennis received a death sentence in Cumberland County Superior Court in June 1986, but he's been trying to fight the sentencing ever since. Not long after settling into Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, Tim Hennis got a curious piece of mail, a postcard from someone claiming to be Mr. X, who claimed they did the crime. This was just a ploy for him to try and escape his death sentence. But it didn't work. Hennis' lawyers called it a prank, but they still kept it on file. The prosecution also received a nearly identical postcard, but they also ignored it because the evidence against him was far too much to brush off his sentence. But Hennis' attorneys weren't slouches. They poured hours into appeals, and after more than 2 years on death row, their persistence paid off. The courts overturned his conviction and ordered a retrial, which kicked off on February 27, 1989. The prosecution came prepared with new ammunition, a neighbor named Elisa Peabody. At first, she'd claimed she saw nothing the night of the murders, but now she was certain she'd seen Hennis leaving the scene. The defense came out swinging, ready to dismantle the prosecution's case. The witnesses were forced into rigorous cross-examinations. Lucille Cook, the ATM lady, was first. At first, she saw no one at the machine, but she suddenly identified Hennis. In court, the defense used bank records and timed how long a minute or two actually felt, exposing major inconsistencies. Patrick, the prosecution's star witness, admitted under pressure that he'd been charged with theft using a stolen ATM card, charges that mysteriously disappeared. His friend Sean Buckner testified about a letter Patrick wrote, admitting he didn't really know who he'd seen. The defense's secret weapon was John Raupak, a man who was spotted near the Eastburn home. When he took the stand, he looked exactly like Hennis. Raupak described himself as 6 feet 4 inches, wearing a black members-only jacket and dark pants, matching Patrick's exact description of the man he claimed to see. The case against Hennis crumbled, and he was acquitted in 1989. Many thought this was it. The justice system had failed the Eastburn family, but new DNA evidence in 2007 linked him to the crime scene. Double jeopardy laws prevented a state retrial, so the military reactivated the retired sergeant to court-martial him. This time, Hennis admitted that he had slept with Katie with her consent the night of the murders. He claimed that he withheld this detail because he didn't want to hurt the husband's feelings. But the military jury rejected his claims and found him guilty on 3 counts of premeditated murder on April 9, 2010. In 2020, he was put on death row in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. But his conviction and death sentence were upheld. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final appeal in 2021. Story 5. Say be careful who you let into your home. But here's a question: if you were Cheryl, would you open your door in the middle of the night for your ex-convict brother-in-law? Well, this video says it all. On the 22nd of July, 1977, Connecticut witnessed what was at the time its largest mass murder, a crime so horrifying that the state Supreme Court described it as brutal and apparently motiveless. And trust me, the gruesome details will haunt you long after you hear them. And we're not here to sensationalize, it's raw, real, and devastating. And just like always, we're peeling back the layers of this nightmare to uncover what really happened to the Bedouin family. Let's start by getting to know the family and their world. The Bedouin family lived in a small, tight-knit community on Cedar Hill Drive in Prospect, Connecticut. Back in 1977, this little town had a population of just over 6,500 people. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other, and the charm of rural life created a sense of peace and safety. This close-knit vibe might seem like a small detail, but trust me, it plays a key role in what unfolded later. Now let's talk about the Bedoin household. Because it wasn't just your typical family. There were 10 people living under one roof. At the head of the family was Frederick Bedoin, the father, and Cheryl, the mother, who was only 29 at the time. Together, they had 7 children ranging from toddlers to preteens. The eldest, 12-year-old Frederick Jr., was followed by 10-year-old Sharon, Lee, 9-year-old Deborah, an 8-year-old Paul, 6-year-old Roderick, 5-year-old Holly Lynn, and 4-year-old Mary Lou. If that wasn't enough, their 6-year-old niece Jennifer Santoro also lived with them. With so many young lives in the mix, their home must have been a lively and chaotic place, full of the everyday ups and downs of a big family. And as you can imagine, the Bedoin family had a pretty lively and fun time together. And that was definitely true on the night of Thursday, July 21st, 1977. The 8 kids were enjoying themselves swimming and playing around in their neighbor's pool in Prospect, Connecticut. The air was filled with laughter, splashes, and carefree moments. Just a typical summer evening. Now, life for the Bedoin family wasn't exactly about luxury, but they weren't struggling either. They had enough to get by and were grateful for what they had despite not being wealthy. They created a warm, loving home that radiated happiness. On that particular night, Cheryl, the mom, was keeping an eye on the kids while they were having a blast at the pool. Meanwhile, Frederick Bedoin, the father, was working his 3rd shift at the Pratt & Whitney factory, trying to provide for his family. But then things took an unexpected turn when a man showed up at the pool. Now, this man was no stranger. In fact, the kids were thrilled to see him. The neighbor recalled how they all rushed over to greet him, showering him with hugs and kisses. It was clear that he was someone they knew well and trusted. After a little, while the kids wrapped up their fun in the pool and went home with this man, while the neighbor went inside, and the evening continued as it would for any other family. But little did anyone know this night would soon take a dark and tragic turn that would change everything forever. Around 4:15 in the morning, the quiet of the early hours was shattered when neighbors started to smell smoke. At first they thought it might be someone burning leaves or trash, but then they heard something far more alarming: screams coming from the Bedouin house. That's when they realized something was seriously wrong, and quickly called 911 to report. The fire trucks from both Prospect and the nearby town of Bethany rushed to the scene, sirens piercing through the night. The firefighters worked tirelessly, and after about 30 minutes they managed to extinguish the blaze. But what came next was something no one could have prepared for as the smoke cleared and the flames died down. Firefighters began searching the house inside. They discovered an unspeakable tragedy. The bodies of Cheryl Bedoin, her 7 children, and her 6-year-old niece, Jennifer Santoro, were found throughout the home. Each one had been brutally killed before the fire. Cheryl's charred body was found on the kitchen floor. 3 of the children were discovered in one bedroom, while 2 more were in another. 1 child was found in the master bedroom, and 2 more were located in the bathroom. The scene was nothing short of horrifying, adding to the nightmare. Many of the victims, including Cheryl, had their hands tied behind their backs. 2 of the children had their feet bound, and everyone appeared to have suffered severe head injuries before the fire consumed their bodies. It was a crime of unimaginable cruelty, and the sheer brutality shocked even the most experienced investigators. All of the bodies were burned extensively, said Edward P. Leonard, the state police commissioner at the time. His statement only hinted at the unimaginable horror that firefighters and police had witnessed. Some neighbors later admitted they had woken up to the smell of smoke, but didn't immediately think much of it. It wasn't until they heard the chilling screams that they realized the danger and called for help. One neighbor, Joseph Polino, tried to help. He ran to the Bedouin house and attempted to enter, but the fire was already too intense. He later recounted the terrifying scene, saying, "I opened the back door and got driven back by a blast of heat. Then the picture window blew out." As mentioned earlier, Frederick Bedoin, the father of the family, was at work at the Pratt and Whitney factory in North Haven. Working the 3rd shift around 5:30 in the morning, police arrived at his workplace to pick him up. They didn't tell him what had happened, only that he needed to come with. Then they drove him to his mother's house, where the family's Reverend Joseph Donnelly was waiting to deliver the devastating news. After hearing it, Frederick turned to Reverend Joseph with a question that no parent or spouse should ever have to ask. "Are they all dead?" Joseph's somber response confirmed his worst fears. Everything Frederick held dear, his wife, his children, his entire family, was gone in one horrifying night, shattered by grief. He reportedly said through tears, "There's only one thing: to see the bastard pay." But while Frederick was dealing with this unimaginable loss, we're already working tirelessly to find answers. They set up a command post at Prospect Town Hall and began stopping every car traveling along Route 68. They were determined to leave no stone unturned. Additionally, back at the Bedoin home, police continued their investigation. That's when they noticed something strange. All the doors and windows were locked. This raised an alarming question. How could the killer have escaped if everything was locked from the inside? It pointed to the chilling possibility that whoever committed the crime was already inside the house, or somehow locked the doors behind them. Naturally, the investigators started talking to neighbors. That's when they learned about a man named Lorna Quinn, the very same man who visited while the kids were enjoying their time at the neighbor's pool. But that wasn't all. The neighbors said they saw him again early Friday morning, sitting alone in a black sedan, parked in a nearby church parking lot about a mile from the house. This information raised red flags for the investigators. Who was this man, and why was he hanging around the house before and after the tragedy? The neighbors filled in more details about Lauren's connection to the Bedoin family. As it turns out, he wasn't just some random figure on the periphery of their lives. For about 2 years, he had actually lived in their basement. Then out of the blue, he vanished from their lives. But just as abruptly as he had disappeared, he reappeared on that fateful Thursday night, the same night the Bedoin kids had been swimming at the neighbor's pool. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Meanwhile, investigators couldn't afford to overlook anyone. Not even Frederick, the grieving father. In the early stages of any investigation, the people closest to the victims are often scrutinized. So when officers asked Frederick for permission to search his truck, he didn't hesitate. He had nothing to hide. The search came up clean. No evidence, no suspicious items, but it was a necessary step in ruling him out. By the time the investigation hit the 24-hour mark, it was already a whirlwind of activity. Police weren't wasting a second. They had set up roadblocks, spoken to neighbors, and interviewed over 100 witnesses, including both Frederick and Lauren. Every detail was critical, and no piece of information was too small to be considered. However, when officers ran Lauren Aquin's name through their system, what they uncovered was far more troubling than anything they had heard from the neighbors. This wasn't just a man with a few minor run-ins with the law. His criminal record revealed a pattern that painted him as someone with a dangerous, unpredictable streak. In April of 1974, was sentenced to prison for larceny. He served less than a year before being released in February of 1975, but freedom didn't suit him for long. By March of 1976, he was back behind bars after attempting to escape custody, a desperate and reckless act that hinted at his bold, unrestrained nature after serving time for that charge. He was paroled in September of 1976. Now here's the part that truly raised red flags when the tragedy at the boudoir house happened. Lauren had only been out of prison for 7 months. 7 months. That's hardly enough time to rebuild a stable life, let alone prove himself as a changed man. And yet here he was connected to the scene of one of the most devastating crimes the community had ever witnessed for investigators. The timing and circumstances surrounding Lauren's reappearance were impossible. To ignore his criminal past combined with his strange behavior in the days leading up to the tragedy created a picture that was hard to dismiss. Why had he returned to the boudoir home after being gone for so long? Why was he spotted sitting in a black sedan in a nearby church parking lot the morning after the fire? To make matters even more intense, investigators uncovered a shocking twist. Lauren wasn't just some random person with a criminal past. He was actually Frederick's foster brother. Talk about a wild turn of events. On the morning of July 22nd at around 9:30 a.m. investigators went over to Lauren's apartment asking him to come in for questioning. To everyone's surprise, he agreed without hesitation. He calmly went with them to the police station. But what happened next took everyone off guard. Lauren didn't just answer questions. He laid it all out. He was ready to confess, and he didn't just give some vague or wishy-washy response. Instead, he gave a chilling, detailed account of the crime that sent shivers down everyone's spine. He admitted to attacking his sister-in-law and the children to make sure they were on the right track. Police didn't just stop at one round of questioning. They asked him the same questions 3 different times, and each time his story stayed exactly the same, even when they brought in his psychiatrist to talk to him. Lauren didn't back off from his confession. At this point, it was clear as day Lauren was the one responsible. He was arrested and charged with 9 counts of murder and 1 count of arson. But the investigators weren't taking any chances. They made him write up a full confession, a 7-page document that spelled out every detail of what had happened. The facts were so specific and accurate that no one else could have known them. Certainly not from the news or outside sources. It was all from Lauren himself. But that's not where the story ended later. That day on July 23rd, investigators found even more damning evidence. A trash bag filled with bloody clothes was found near Lauren's driveway. And even more chilling, bloody shoes and socks were discovered in the trunk of his car, the very same car that people had seen him parked in at the church the night of the crime. All of this lined up perfectly with what Lauren had confessed. The evidence was stacking up like a mountain pointing directly at him. But if you'd think that at this time the case was closed and Lauren is locked up for good, well, not quite. Things were about to take another unexpected turn. Even though everything seemed to be going in the direction of a quick conviction, Lauren's defense team wasn't ready to throw in the towel. Just yet they were still looking for ways to create doubt to turn the tide in their favor. While the evidence against him was stacking up, his confession, the bloody clothes, the witnesses, his lawyer was fighting tooth and nail to poke holes in the prosecution's case. John R. Williams wasn't going to let it slide without putting up a serious challenge. Even with everything seemingly pointing to Lauren's guilt, the defense team started pushing for a delay, arguing that the court had overstepped by requesting a blood sample from Lauren. Without solid evidence, they wanted the confession and the blood evidence excluded from the trial, and they tried to introduce new theories like the possibility that Cheryl's brother might be the real killer, but the court wasn't buying it. They saw the evidence for what it was: clear, consistent, and chilling, and refused to allow the defense to shift the focus elsewhere. The trial continued as planned, and when the jury was finally sworn in on July 16, 1979, it felt like the final chapter was getting closer. Then came the day everyone had been waiting for, the public reveal of Lauren's confession. And let me tell you, it didn't disappoint. It was a detailed, gruesome account of everything he had done. Lauren confessed to killing Cheryl, her children, and others, describing each moment with cold precision. He even talked about how he went to the house in the evening to pick raspberries with the kids before the violence began. It was hard to believe. But Lauren's story didn't end there. According to him, after leaving the house around 8:30 p.m., he came back in the early hours of the morning around 2 or 3 a.m., slipping inside through the unlocked basement door. Once in the kitchen, he casually turned on the light, and that's when Cheryl came down to see what was going on. According to Lauren, she didn't seem too surprised to see him, and when he asked to grab some tools from the basement to fix his car, she let him go without a second thought. But things quickly took a deadly turn after getting the lug wrench. Lauren came back upstairs and asked Cheryl for a beer. She didn't think anything was off about it. After all, he was family, right? But the moment she turned her back to get the beer, Lauren hit her over the head with the lug wrench. And that wasn't the end of it. He kept swinging, hitting her over and over again. Without hesitation, the worst part, Lauren claimed Cheryl didn't make a sound. She didn't scream, didn't cry for help. I can't even imagine what was going through her mind at that moment. Was she trying to stay quiet so she wouldn't alert her children? Was she hoping to survive this attack without drawing attention? Unfortunately, it didn't work. One of the kids heard the noise and rushed to the kitchen, only to be struck by Lauren with the same wrench from there. He went on to attack the other children using the wrench and a tire iron. But when he heard Cheryl moaning in the kitchen, meaning she was still alive despite the brutal blows, he went back and started stabbing her. Lauren later confessed to the police that he tied up some of the children with string and then tragically assaulted 10-year-old Sharon. Before killing her, just think about the horror this poor child experienced, beaten senseless. And then assaulted at just 10 years old. After all of that, he drenched everyone's, Cheryl and the children, in gasoline and set the entire house ablaze. However, when Lauren took the stand on September 5, 1979, his story took a complete turn. He denied everything he had confessed to. He said, "I didn't do any of that." He claimed that he only signed the confession because the psychiatrist told him it would be better for him. According to Lauren, the psychiatrist had said, "You'd be better off if you signed." Lauren also claimed that he repeatedly requested a lawyer during his interrogation, expressing his desire to speak with one over and over. However, the police repeatedly denied his requests, insisting that they already knew he was guilty. They urged him to simply confess, convincing him that it would be better for him if he did. When questioned about the blood stains on his clothes, Lauren offered an unusual explanation. He claimed that the blood wasn't from the murders, but from a fight he had gotten into the night of the killings. According to Lauren, he had been out for coffee when some men outside the cafe attacked him in retaliation. He said he fought back and ended up beating them. That's where the blood came from. He insisted it was a strange and highly unlikely story that left many people skeptical of his account. The situation took an even more bizarre turn when Lauren described his reaction upon learning about the murders. He stated that when the police first informed him about the killings, he was so enraged that he punched a wall in the police barracks. He claimed that in his anger, he warned the state trooper, telling him that they better catch the killers before he did. Now, during the trial, the prosecutors introduced a photo of the 7 murdered children showing their innocent faces, which had never been seen by the jury before. This photograph led Lauren's lawyer to argue for a mistrial, suggesting that the emotional impact of the image could unfairly influence the jury's opinion. However, the judge dismissed the motion, and the trial continued without interruption as the case progressed. Certain pieces of evidence seemed to lend some credibility to Lauren's version of events. For instance, the way he reacted when first informed of the murders mirrored exactly what he had claimed in his confession. This alignment raised questions about whether he had actually committed the crimes, or if he had been coerced into admitting to them. Moreover, a state police fingerprint expert testified during the trial that the bloody handprint found in the bathtub wasn't Lauren's. In fact, the handprint on one of the door jambs didn't match his either. This revelation raised further doubts about his involvement, particularly since the prints didn't match any of the victims, or even Frederick, the father. There was also the matter of a prior interview with Lauren conducted in October of 1977 by reporter Lincoln Milstein from the local newspaper, The Current. This interview, which had been kept under wraps until the confession was released, revealed even more contradictions. Lauren admitted to Milstein that he had no recollection of the killings. The only things he remembered were vague snippets, talking to Cheryl, seeing bodies and blood everywhere, and the house being on fire. He claimed that he had been so frightened and confused by what had happened that he didn't remember the events clearly. However, things took a turn in October 1977, when Lauren was transferred to a state mental hospital in Middleton for security reasons, and a few weeks later, he was officially committed. A psychiatrist testified that he might be suffering from schizophrenia or epilepsy, raising doubts about his mental state at the time of the confession. With this in mind, some argued that his statements were unreliable, and this further questioned his accountability for the crimes. Fast forward to October 1979. The jury deliberated for hours over the course of 3 days before finding Lauren guilty on all counts of murder. Did not charge him with SA, despite speculation that he might have been driven to kill after feeling ashamed. Allegedly molesting one or more of the Bedouin girls, Chief Assistant State's Attorney Walter Scanlon suggested this could have been the motive, although it was never definitively proven. The state tried to get the maximum possible prison sentence of 245 years, which is 25 years for each murder and 20 years for arson, but Judge Walter Pickett sentenced Lauren to 105 years to life in prison. With the possibility of parole after 50 or 55 years, the decision was made, but it didn't take long before. Lauren's attorney filed an appeal so quickly, in fact, that it seemed as though the appeal had been pre-written and ready to go. However, the court denied his appeal and Lauren was sent to prison. Over the years, Lauren continued to fight his conviction, filing petitions for a habeas corpus trial. Despite his efforts, each petition was rejected, and his legal battles seemed to go nowhere. And for those unfamiliar with the term habeas corpus, it refers to a writ used to bring an accused person from a different jurisdiction to the court in the place where the crime occurred, essentially allowing for the review of the case. In Lauren's case, he argued that he was wrongfully convicted and that his confession should not have been used against him. Lauren was eventually transferred to McDougall Walker Correctional Facility in Suffield, Connecticut, where he spent 38 years behind bars. During this time, he accumulated 8 disciplinary offenses, including assault, possession of drugs, contraband, and other violations. His last infraction occurred in 1997, when he was charged with assault and refusing to provide a specimen. Then in June of 2015, Lauren's health took a drastic turn. He was placed on a ventilator in the intensive care unit after suffering a severe medical crisis. As the Department of Correction indicated, Lauren had no family willing or able to make medical decisions for him. The judge was called to make a decision regarding his care, but before the meeting could take place, Lauren passed away from a severe brain bleed. He was 65 years old at the time of his death, having entered prison at the age of 27. His death remained shrouded in mystery, as no autopsy was performed, and the cause of the brain bleed was never determined following his death. Robert DeClark, the former owner of the funeral home, sought and received custody of Lauren's remains after performing a cremation. Lauren's ashes were stored, and DeClark periodically brought them to the Department of Correction in the hopes of finding any relatives who might come forward. But no one did, and to be honest, it feels like Lauren got exactly what he deserved alone, and forgotten no child. Not even Cheryl deserves a death like that, the violence, the cruelty. It's almost impossible to wrap your mind around the lingering heartbreak. Must have been unbearable for the remaining family. Especially Fred the father. Can you imagine the gut-wrenching realization that it was his own foster brother who had claimed the lives of his loved ones? It must have been indescribable. So that brings us to the million-dollar question: was the sentence just, or did Lauren somehow slip through the cracks with a punishment that didn't quite fit the crime? Story 6. In 2016, these 3 homes of the Rodan family would become the scene of one of the most chilling and heartbreaking massacres Ohio has ever known. I just might tell you, this is just the most bizarre story I've ever seen in being involved in law enforcement. On the night of April 21st into the early hours of the 22nd, 8 members of the Rodan family were executed in their bed. But what made this tragedy even more chilling was the fact that 3 innocent children, all under the age of 3, were mysteriously spared. So who could commit such an unspeakable act, and why? What happened inside those 3 houses would uncover a tangled web of secrets, betrayal, and a motive that no one, and I mean no one, ever saw coming. The woman reporting the incident was Bobby Jo Manley, the sister of one of the victims. On the morning of April 22nd, she arrived at the family farm to feed the animals, a chore that had been part of her regular routine. But what she walked into that morning would change her life forever. As she stepped inside one of the 3 homes on the property, she immediately sensed something was horribly wrong. The house was eerily silent, far too silent for a family that usually filled it with life. Bobby Jo, along with her brother James, began to search the house, calling out to see if anyone was around. What they found next would be etched in their minds forever. In the living room, Christopher Roden Sr., the 40-year-old patriarch of the family, lay lifeless. His body was riddled with 9 gunshot wounds, each fired from close range. 5 of the bullets had hit his face and head, while another 3 struck his torso, and a single shot pierced his arm, as if he'd tried to fend off the attack in his sleep. This was the only sign of resistance from anyone in the house. Nearby in a different room, they found Gary Rodan, Christopher's 38-year-old cousin. Gary had been shot twice in the head, with a 3rd shot fired so close to his temple it left a muzzle stamp. Unlike Christopher, there were no signs of struggle, and it was believed that Gary had been asleep when the killer or killers struck. The brutality of the scene left Bobby Jo and James in shock, struggling to comprehend the horror before them. Without wasting another moment, Bobby Joe dialed 911, her voice trembling with fear as she reported the unimaginable violence she had just discovered. In the next house, the scene was equally horrific. Clarence Frankie Rodan, Chris's eldest son, and his fiancée Hannah Hazel Gilly were found murdered in their bed. Their 4-month-old baby was miraculously unharmed, lying peacefully between them. However, their 3-year-old child had been found asleep on the floor, unaware of the nightmare unfolding around them. Frankie had been shot 3 times in the head and face, while Hannah had been shot through the eye, and then 4 more times. It was a cold, brutal execution. Manley then rushed to the third home, that of his sister Dana Roden, Chris Sr.'s ex-wife, where she lived with their 16-year-old son, Chris Jr., and their 19-year-old daughter, Hannah. Hannah had just given birth to her second child, only 4 days before. Dana's fate was just as horrifying. She had been shot 5 times in the head, including point-blank shots through her temple and another upward shot under her chin. In a nearby room, Chris Jr. had been shot twice through the top of his head, and in the final room, Hannah Roden was found dead from 2 fatal gunshots to the head. But in a chilling twist, Hannah's newborn was unharmed, still attempting to nurse from her mother's lifeless breast. Fortunately, Hannah's 2-year-old daughter Sophia had been staying with her father and had been spared the horror of that night. As police and first responders flooded the scene, the community began to gather in shock, trying to process the brutal killings. But the horror didn't stop there. Donald Stone, a cousin of Chris Roden Sr., began to worry about another family member, Kenneth Roden, who lived just a few miles down the road. He called Kenneth's phone repeatedly, but when there was no answer, Stone and 2 friends decided to go check on him. They found his house unlocked, and as they entered, they discovered Kenneth Rodan's body. He had been murdered too, with a single gunshot wound through his eye, fired at close range. 8 members of the same family were now dead, each victim found within their own home. It was clouded by one terrifying reality. There was almost no trace of who had committed the crime. There were no shell casings, no gunshots heard, and shockingly, 2 pit bulls known for being fiercely protective didn't even bark that night. The dogs, who usually growled at anyone they didn't recognize, stood silent, adding a strange layer of mystery to the scene. Even more chilling, not a single cell phone was found among the victims, and there were no signs of theft. It was as though the phones had been deliberately taken, possibly to remove evidence. This eerie absence suggested that the killers might have planned their attack meticulously, eliminating any chance for the victims to alert anyone. The sheer scale of the massacre, combined with the victims' inability to defend themselves, hinted at multiple assailants. But who could have carried out such a heinous act? As forensic experts from the County Sheriff's Department and the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation sifted through the scene for clues, the investigation struggled to keep up with the flood of rumors and the silent code that runs through the tight-knit community. As families buried their dead in the shadowed hills of Appalachian, Ohio, the real question loomed. What could have sparked such a brutal killing spree? The Rodan family patriarch, Chris Rodan Sr., and his brother Kenneth, were known for having brushes with the law. Their reputation had been tarnished further by the discovery of a pot-growing operation near Kenneth's barn and the unsettling hint of a cockfighting ring at the family compound. These findings sparked suspicion that criminal activity had led to their deaths. Rumors swirled, pointing to potential ties with a Mexican drug cartel whose brutal methods were notorious. But those killings usually occurred much farther south. Pike County had seen a few small-scale drug busts linked to cartels, but the idea that the Rodden's operation could be connected to something larger was unsettling. Other whispers suggested the family had ties to the Cornbread Mafia, an infamous drug operation that spanned the central Appalachian Mountains. Known for running pill mills and meth labs, this group made use of the region's isolated hollows with easy access to state lines to move materials. While the Cornbread Mafia was known for violence, nothing like this mass slaughter had ever been linked to them. Law enforcement had to consider the possibility that this notorious group had evolved, taking its brutal tactics into new, dangerous territory. Hundreds of tips flooded in, and rewards were offered in the hopes of finding answers, but the truth remained elusive. Investigators were stuck in a web of dead ends, each promising lead turned to dust. Desperate for answers, they seized the evidence from the Rodan property, vehicles, mobile homes, anything that might hold a clue, and stored it, hoping the next piece of the puzzle would surface. Meanwhile, the fate of the 3 children left behind lingered, especially 2-year-old Sophia, who had been with her father and other relatives the night of the killings. Little did anyone know at the time, this child would become the key to unlocking the entire mystery. What initially seemed like a professional hit carried out by organized crime was, in reality, something far more personal, a deep-rooted feud between two families, with young Sophia at the heart of it all. Billy Wagner and Chris Rodden Sr. had a history, one that ran deep in the underbelly of their community. These two men had likely crossed paths more than once, whether as partners or rivals in crime. The local gossip ran rampant, with whispers of their ties to criminal activity, but it wasn't just the men whose lives were intertwined. Billy's son Jake and Chris's daughter Hannah had a turbulent relationship that had lasted years. Since Hannah was just 13, their love affair had blossomed, and from it came the child that would set everything into motion, Sophia. In the wake of the massacre, Billy Wagner appeared to put on a show of concern for Sophia's well-being, going as far as filing for custody of the child. What raised red flags, however, was the timing. The custody documents were allegedly signed by Hannah herself, giving Billy sole custody if anything were to happen to her. Investigators couldn't ignore how conveniently the Wagners seemed to have prepared for this very moment. But this was only the beginning. After the murders, the Wagners seemingly vanished from Pike County. They packed up and moved to Alaska, as far away from the violent crime scene as they could get. The town of Pike County, still reeling from the horror, slowly returned to its routine, and the Wagners were almost forgotten, until they resurfaced about a year later. When they returned, it wasn't just Jake Wagner and his family. It was a new wife for Jake, and the entire family seemed to reintegrate smoothly into the community. Now everything seemed normal, but something fell off. The Wagners, who had once been known for their isolation and odd behaviors, were suddenly playing the role of model citizens, all working at a local trucking company. This was a far cry from their usual pattern. Jake and George, the Wagner brothers, had grown up in a family that kept everything close to the chest. They were homeschooled, isolated from others, and their parents, Billy and Angela, kept a tight grip on every decision the family made. Even after the divorce, the family unit remained unbreakable, Angela living just down the road, but still part of the tightly controlled family system. As each family member entered new relationships, the control of the Wagners never loosened. When George married, his wife was absorbed into their world, and when Jake married, it was clear that she would be no exception to the suffocating family dynamic. What looked like a close-knit family was actually a manipulative, controlling unit that bound each member in a web of secrecy. Shortly after the Wagner family returned to Pike County from their time in Alaska, something strange happened that set off alarm bells. The two women, Jake's new wife and his mother, suddenly bolted. The reasons they fled, what they told the police, and the whispers shared with family members remained shrouded in mystery. But, as if on cue, the investigation into the family massacre took an unexpected turn, focusing on the Wagner family. The illusion of friendship and their so-called concern for Sophia crumbled, and a darker truth began to surface. One of illicit love, jealousy, and a sinister conspiracy. What unfolded was no fairy tale. It was a calculated tale of manipulation and murder, all orchestrated to take permanent custody of young Sophia. The prosecution, led by Assistant Attorney General Angela Canopa, began pulling back the layers of a story that had been brewing in the shadows. It all started with a love story, or more accurately, a dangerous obsession. At just 13 years old, Hannah Mae Rodan was at the Pike County Fairgrounds when she met Jake Wagner, almost 18 at the time. What began as innocent curiosity over bunnies quickly spiraled into something far darker. Despite their age difference, Jake and Hannah began a relationship. Incredibly, Chris Rodden Sr., Hannah's father, approved, even though the age gap and the circumstances raised major red flags. But Chris, who knew Billy Wagner, Jake's father, gave his permission, albeit with conditions. Hannah wasn't allowed to be alone with Jake. A chaperone had to accompany her on every outing. But this wasn't just a romantic fling. This was a relationship fueled by a growing jealousy. And soon the cracks began to show. As time passed, Hannah and Jake's relationship soured. After an alleged incident where Jake choked Hannah, she fled to her father, saying she couldn't handle the toxic environment. Not just from Jake, but from the entire Wagner family, who had their claws in every aspect of her life. Then things took a darker turn. Hannah, in a moment of desperation, made a public statement on social media. She would never give her child up to Jake, even if it cost her life. What she didn't know was that her private post was being monitored by Jake and his mother, Angela Wagner. They had hacked into her Facebook account, and that message became a ticking time bomb that set the families on a tragic course toward violence. Jake was not only furious about the breakup, but he was also deeply resentful of the people who had been involved in Hannah and Sophia's life. His anger was reaching a boiling point. During this period, Hannah began seeing someone new, Charlie Gilly, the brother of her sister-in-law. Their brief relationship ended with yet another pregnancy, and this was the breaking point for Jake. But it wasn't just his anger. It was the Wagner family's chilling calculation that began to take shape. Months before the birth of Hannah's second child, the Wagners had gathered around a table to discuss a devastating plan. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It had been thought out and planned meticulously. Billy Wagner, Jake's father, presented a chilling proposal. They would not only remove Hannah from the picture, but anyone else who had a claim to Sophia. The Wagner family, as they often did, voted on the plan, deciding who would be eliminated and how they would proceed. The ultimate goal was clear: to ensure that no one could challenge their claim to Sophia, and that the custody of the child would fall into their hands, no matter the cost. With a tragic finality, they decided that 7 people had to die, and that no one would be left to stand in their way. The killings would be carried out, and once they were done, would file legal motions to gain custody of Sophia. The Wagner family believed that after their calculated violence, no one would dare challenge them again. They began by making seemingly innocent purchases, but each item had a purpose in their twisted plan. They started by buying athletic shoes from a local Walmart, but these weren't just any shoes. They were the wrong sizes for the Wagner sons, and were brand new, untouched by anyone's feet. These shoes were carefully chosen for the night of the murders, so the footprints they left behind would be harder to trace to them. The Wagners were meticulous, and this was just the beginning of their careful preparations. Along with the shoes, they secured handguns, specifically .22 caliber long rifles and semi-automatic pistols. These were quieter than larger calibers and had less recoil, making them perfect for close-range covert killings. But they didn't stop there. The Wagners also acquired suppressors, which wouldn't completely silence the gunshots, but would reduce the noise to a muffled sound like a cough, so that no one outside of the trailers could hear the gunfire. They also bought brass catchers, little pouches attached to the pistols to catch the spent shells, ensuring they didn't leave behind any physical evidence. In the months leading up to the murders, the Wagners practiced relentlessly. Jake and his brother spent hours shooting in a secluded wooded area behind their property. Bullets were found lodged in the trees, and remnants of a burned-out homemade suppressor were recovered during the investigation, confirming their extensive practice. They were preparing for the moment when they would carry out the unimaginable, but their preparation didn't stop at weapons. They also purchased a cell phone jamming device, which they planned to use to ensure that no one could call for help during the killings. As if this wasn't enough, they went as far as dyeing their hair to alter their appearances and avoid being identified. Meanwhile, Angela Wagner, the mother, was busy forging crucial documents. She created fake papers that showed Hannah Roden had signed a statement, declaring that if something happened to her, custody of her daughter Sophia would go to Jake and his family. These documents were meant to be revealed after the murders, in an attempt to make it seem as though the Wagners were just concerned relatives who were trying to step in for the good of the child, hoping that no one would question the timing or the circumstances of the custody arrangement. As the Wagners prepared, they also began staking out the Rodan family's homes. They knew the routine of every person, when they came home, when they left, how late they stayed up, and whether anyone visited after dark. They learned everything they needed to know. The Wagners were ready. The time had come. The night of the murders, right after Hannah Rodan gave birth to her second child, the Wagners set their plan into motion. While Hannah recovered at home with her newborn, Sophia was sent to stay with the Wagners for a couple of nights. This was the opening they needed. The Wagners drove to the Rodan family property, which consisted of 3 trailers and several outbuildings. They were familiar with the layout and the people, and they knew exactly what to do. Billy Wagner, the father, entered Chris Rodan Sr. home, under the guise of discussing a potential drug deal. Meanwhile, Jake and his brother George hid in the pickup truck, waiting. Once inside, Billy moved with ruthless efficiency, gaining the trust of his victim, setting the stage for what would follow. The Wagners moved from home to home, killing everyone in their path, adults and teenagers alike. But they left the young children, including the newborn baby, unharmed, just as they had planned. They carried out the murders with brutal precision, making sure that no one would survive to testify against them. And then, like shadows in the night, they disappeared. Their next move was to dispose of any evidence that could link them to the killings. The truck was abandoned, their clothes and shoes were discarded, and the weapons, the most damning evidence, were carefully hidden. In an ingenious twist, the Wagners sent their cousin, a fisherman, a gruesome gift. The guns, shell casings, and suppressor remnants were placed in gallon buckets, filled with wet cement, and turned into boat anchors. The anchors were then dropped into a local lake, where they would sink to the bottom, far from anyone's reach. The Wagners went to great lengths to ensure that they would never be caught. They even maintained a public facade of grief-stricken, shocked family members who were devastated by the tragedy. They pretended to be innocent, heartbroken individuals, even as they returned to Ohio after their time in Alaska. But the cracks in their perfect lie began to show. Perhaps it was the two women who left the family, or maybe someone overheard a conversation at work. Whatever it was, law enforcement began to piece the puzzle together. It wouldn't be long before the Wagners' carefully crafted world of deceit would come crumbling down. Their calculated and cold-blooded plan, designed to erase any trace of evidence, would eventually unravel, leading them straight to the heart of their gruesome crimes. The authorities had hidden listening devices inside the work trucks used by the family. They also started tapping their phones, trying to gather every scrap of evidence they could. The Wagners were questioned, but their involvement with the Rodan family remained a mystery to the public. The investigators kept working tirelessly, piecing together every clue, until they were finally able to charge them with the gruesome murders. We promised that the day would come when arrests would be made in the Pike County massacres. Today is that day. George Billy Wagner III, his wife Angela Wagner, and their sons, George Wagner IV and Edward Jake Wagner. As the investigation progressed, the Wagners tried to maintain their innocence. But 2 years after being locked up, the pressure finally got to Jake. Under the weight of the silence and the months of imprisonment, Jake admitted to everything, confessing to all 23 charges against him. In exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table for him and his family, he agreed to tell everything. Jake revealed chilling details about the murders. He said that he personally pulled the trigger on 5 of the killings, leaving the remaining 3 deaths for his father and brother. Jake also admitted that while his mother didn't take part in the killings, she was deeply involved in the conspiracy, the cover-up, and even the forgery of custody documents to ensure they would get the child. The investigation uncovered key evidence that helped confirm Jake's story. Text messages from the night of the killings aligned with the details he gave about the meeting between Billy Wagner and Chris Rodan. Weapons hidden in cement anchors, bullets matching those found in the bodies, and evidence of homemade suppressors were recovered from various locations, including the Wagners' property. They also found remnants of burned-out suppressors in the woods, the same type of suppressors used during the killings. This new information led to major breakthroughs in the case, with the Wagners now facing serious consequences. Jake's sentencing brought a sense of resolution, as he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 32 years, though this decision was met with mixed reactions. His confession was key to the closure of this chapter, though his actions remain unforgivable for the families who suffered from this horrific crime. His mother, Angela Wagner, was also sentenced to 30 years in prison for her role in the conspiracy, despite not being directly involved in the killings. Her involvement in the plot to murder the Rodan family and the subsequent cover-up was central to her conviction. The sentencing hearing was emotionally charged with survivors of the victims calling out the Wagners for their cruelty. Meanwhile, George Wagner IV, who had decided to go to trial instead of cooperating, received a harsher sentence, 8 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. His refusal to admit guilt and his choice to face a trial made him ineligible for the same considerations that Jake received. The case against the Wagner family is now nearing its final stages, with only George Billy Wagner III left to stand trial. His role as the patriarch of the Wagner family makes his trial one of the most anticipated moments in this lengthy and devastating case. Now imagine being one of the surviving children in the Rodan family, growing up, and one day learning that nearly your entire family was wiped out in one horrifying night, all over a custody dispute. Imagine carrying that truth for the rest of your life. With that weight on your shoulders, you might feel that no punishment could ever truly measure up, and as justice slowly takes shape, with more members of the Wagner family being held accountable, the people of Pike County, and especially the survivors, are left clinging to the hope that this painful chapter is finally coming to an end. as the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Night Scared. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware, even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.